All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Chris Curran. I'm an associate professor of educational leadership and policy here at the University of Florida.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Pacheco. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Teaching and Learning at the University of Florida.
On behalf of our research team, who is well represented here, we've got Kate Harris, Dr. Amber Deeg, I see Tiffany Tan, a couple others, Lily Davis-Boza, who's not able to join us today. We want to say thanks for being here. It's a real pleasure to have this opportunity for the next hour to share some of the research we've been doing, to be in dialogue with some of our advisory board members, and most importantly, to be in conversation with all of you. This session or this panel is called Unlocking the Elementary Science Classroom, Empowering Multilingual Learners for Success. As many of you know, multilingual learners represent a growing proportion of public school students in the United States. And like all students, their science learning in elementary school sets a trajectory for future science achievement, their pursuit of STEM careers, and their eventual contributions to society and the workforce. Over the past 3 years, our team here at the University of Florida has examined the trajectories and the school practices that relate to elementary school science learning among multilingual learners. Our work, which has been funded by the National Science Foundation, has been strengthened by the insights of our advisory board and our external consultant, who are all here with us today as our panelists. They represent a set of leading scholars on science education, multilingual learners, and education policy and leadership generally. So we're delighted today to be joined by our advisory board and our external evaluator for this panel discussion of science learning among multilingual learners in elementary school. Our panelists today, and I'll let them introduce themselves more here just in a second, but they are Dr. Henry Suarez of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Dr. Griff Jones, who is emeritus faculty from the University of Florida and a very well-known science educator, and Dr. Tim Drake from North Carolina State University. And I'm just going to turn it to each of them to give sort of a brief introduction of themselves and a little of their work and research and how it relates to this topic before we get underway. So Dr. Jones, I see you're unmuted. If you don't mind, I'll pass it to you first.
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Sounds great.
So my name is Griff Jones. I was at the University of Florida, both as a classroom teacher at their lab school called PK, Young Developmental Research School. I taught there for 20 years, mostly high school physics, as well as working with the elementary program. I was an elementary science instructor for 20 years. So every day I worked with third, fourth, and fifth graders. And then once a week worked with the K1 and second graders. And then in the afternoon, I would teach my high school physics kids. So I did that for 20 years. And then being part of the UF, went on and got my PhD, and then spent my last 10 years of my career as a science education professor working with teacher preparatory programs. Most of my interest has been in curriculum and instruction, looking at effective teaching practices, particularly within physics education. So still staying active. I'm now retired as an emeritus professor, but still stay active and doing conferences and things when asked, and serving on boards like this. So been great to be involved with this project.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We're honored and have certainly been privileged to have your expertise here. Dr. Suarez?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's actually really cool to see, like this kind of gathering for a project that has been going on for very successfully for a few years. So thanks for bringing us together this way. Yeah, Henry Suarez. I'm an assistant professor of science ed here at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And my area of specialization is elementary age science. My background is in astrophysics, but the past 14 years, 14, I've been working on how to make science education more equitable for bilingual learners, multilingual learners, and thinking of how to support their teachers at both the in-service level and pre-service level. And I can share more, but I'll stop there and I'll pass it on to Tim.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here this afternoon with you. My name is Tim Drake. I'm an associate professor of education leadership and policy here at NC State University. Served as an outside consultant for the group. I've researched in the past the trajectories of multilingual learners, particularly those with EL services in the state of Texas from kindergarten up through higher education, looking at the pathways and thinking about those policies around classification and reclassification, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit today. And since then, I've also been working a lot in school leadership, thinking about the role of school leaders in supporting marginalized groups like multilingual learners in turnaround settings and also in the early grade spaces. So that's some of my more recent work, but good to be with you.
Wow. It's quite a panel. Thank you guys all for being here today, and also for all of your work on the project with our research team over the last few years. I'm honored to have this expertise with us today. We're really lucky. So thank you. So today's webinar includes both a panel discussion with each of our panelists, in which we're going to reflect on kind of big questions that relate to multilingual learners' science education, as well as some of the specific findings of our research team's work and some of the work in the field more broadly. As Dr. Kern mentioned, following the panel, we're then going to engage in breakout rooms, providing a space for everybody here to reflect on, ask questions, and I think, as Dr. Kern alluded to, like, we are excited to hear about your experiences within science education with multilingual learners. So with that said, thank you guys so much for being here this afternoon, and we'll get underway right now. Dr. Kern.
Thank you, Mark. And I should have mentioned at the beginning, would love to have folks just briefly drop in an introduction in the chat if you're comfortable. Let us know who you are, where you're coming from, sort of your connection to this work. That would be wonderful as we get going. But I'm going to jump in with our first question. I think our panelists know this. They were involved in some of these conversations, but the team here at UF, as we engaged in this process and this work, I think first grappled with and really spent a lot of time coming to terms with how we conceptualize the student group that we were interested in serving and understanding, particularly multilingual learners. And in fact, we actually kind of ebbed and flowed from, I think, our original proposal using the term emergent bilinguals or English language learners to settling on multilingual learners as our conceptual concept and term that we use throughout the project. And so I just want to kind of start us with a question to sort of ground in that, because I think there's a lot theoretically that can be unpacked, just thinking about who the subgroup is of students and what they consist of and what makes up their experiences. So I want to pose to the panel a question, which is, who are multilingual learners? What do we know about them? And kind of what do we know on a conceptual level in terms of defining and using a term like multilingual learners, and how does that relate maybe to other terms like emergent bilingual or English language learner that are out there in the literature?
Happy to start if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thanks.
I think it's a really important question because I think naming and nomenclature carries a lot of power and a lot of meaning. And I think that, being mindful of how we refer to people is a really important step towards imagining what justice-oriented work or liberation or transformative work looks like. I personally started out with English language learners because that was kind of like the term du jour when I was coming up in my doctoral program. But I was always dissatisfied with the labeling that does, because it assumes that learning English is the only thing that these students are in the schools to do. And as a science educator, like, I was trying to make a space for where these students were actually be able to learn science and math and social studies instead of being pulled out for ESL services all the time. I thought that moving towards a label like emergent bilingual or multilingual recognized not only that they were learners of other things other than English, but also recognized and celebrated their own linguistic repertoire that they would bring to the classroom. I recognize that that term is, all the terms are incomplete in some kind of way. I think that the reality is that who is a multilingual? It can be, I think that, multiple groups of folks or children fall under that umbrella. It can be newcomers, it can be the children of immigrants, it can be the children who were born here who may be second or third generation, who are still classified as English language learners or bilingual learners or multilingual learners, because their their version of English or fluency in English, or however we choose to define that, it's not up to the standard. And by standard, I mean the traditional, white English speaking kind of like norm. And even within that, like what do we mean by that when you are in the Southeast, when you are in the Northwest, when you're in the Southwest, and so on and so forth. So my colleague Maria Gonzalez Howard and I wrote a piece a few years ago where we were pushing the field of science education to move away from the label of English language learner, again, because of the work that has done historically to categorize these students as, in a way deficient, and prohibiting or kind of like foreclosing opportunities for learning language. I also hear folks like Nelson Flores being very clear about like, no, we should use the labels that the districts use for these students because we have to highlight the political power that such a labeling from the system does on students. Ultimately, I think it's always important for us to kind of like consider the labels that we're using and why. The field is moving towards multilingual, and now I'm hearing it as almost like what's the word I'm looking for? Like a euphemism, like diverse, like when we mean something different. So I'm always nervous about how these terms get taken up in a way that continue to hide instead of push us to be more reflective. But that's how I think. I don't know, Tim, Griff, how do you approach this?
In our classrooms, when I taught at PK, it was back then it was the English language learners. It was the same terminology that you're using that when you started, and it grew over the years. And I think, which is a credit to the school, and I think the challenge that we had was, particularly in science education, was that the students were always, I think, behind the 8 ball because they were being pulled out for the English language classes. And when it came to science ed, they already got just a very small fraction, like the other students, of science education. And theirs became usually even smaller than the regular students that weren't pulled out, because sometimes they would come right during what little science time there was, and they would get pulled out of class. So the teachers struggled to try to incorporate as much of their reading and integrate their reading lessons along with the science lessons and the language lessons. And I think those teachers that did that had the most success, and the students felt the most empowered, because it was all became one part of the whole learning experience. So, we were fortunate enough to be able to be flexible in the curriculum materials that we bought. And so we would buy a lot of extended resources that would come in multiple languages, but primarily for us, it was Spanish. And so that was nice, is sometimes we would have the lesson in English, the student activity sheets in English, and there would be the students' activity sheets in Spanish. And we would give them all to everybody. So they each had both English and Spanish, which was always fun. So that, I think it's as much as you can do to integrate it into just the day-to-day instruction, instead of putting it in different silos, the more effective it will be.
Yeah, I echo what everyone's saying. I think one of the original No Child Left Behind terms for this subgroup was limited English proficient, LEP, and then it transitioned to EL and then ELL, and then now multilingual learners. But I think there is power in that asset-based framing, and thinking about this isn't limited. These are assets. I mean, what world wouldn't we want bilingualism? I want it for my children. It's seen as such a benefit, yet in the context of education, historically, it's been seen as through this deficit lens of something lacking in English. And so I think it's a powerful reframing. I know this group, we worked hard, right? Like in the meetings I was in, it was, especially when you're thinking about quantitative data analysis, it's how do you define this subgroup? And there's such a rich diversity that comes with that. I think it's the most exciting subgroup to study, because you have linguistic diversity, you have cultural diversity, you have socioeconomic diversity, you have different proficiency in English and in native languages. I mean, there's just such richness that it seems like this is just such a wonderful area of research. And then you combine that thinking about that subgroup needing that attention with science, which is also such a vibrant field. We know STEM for our economy. So it's just, I just love this work because I felt like the intersection was so powerful to think about this subgroup in this context.
But I appreciate all these responses. And, one thing, Griff, you kind of mentioned the materials often being in Spanish, right? And I think one thing that through our research project we had to grapple with was not just a terminology to use to kind of talk about one group as a monolith, but this recognition that even within multilingual learners, or whatever term you'd like to adopt for the broad group, there's a lot of variation, right? And whether it's, primary language being Spanish or being a non-Spanish language other than English, or whether it's those receiving formal services at school or not receiving formal services at school, intersections with race and home country and so forth. So, just as a follow-up to this before we move to the next question, maybe you could talk a little bit about kind of the heterogeneity and variation even within multilingual learners, and sort of where we see that intersecting with science, whether it's having resources like books or texts that would, be in the second language or not, right? I think that has potentially a lot of implications.
I'm sorry, was that to
yeah.
me or Henri?
Open question. I should direct my questions more
Go
specifically.
ahead, Griff. Yeah, I started last time.
Yeah,
so
Griff,
you should go
I'd be
next
curious in your case, like what happened if you had a student that wasn't speaking Spanish, right? What did that look like in this?
Then it was a struggle for everyone, for the teachers, for myself as a support teacher, and obviously for the student. So the teacher would try to do the best they could to provide some sort of translation for the student, but otherwise they were just struggling.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point, and it's something that even though I myself am English Spanish bilingual, it has always worried me that so much of the work has happened in English Spanish bilingual spaces. I think historically it makes sense because it's happening in California or in Texas or in or even in Florida. But I remember reading studies where they would say 40% of the students were English speakers, 40% of the students were Spanish speakers, and then there's this mysterious 20% that they speak something else that they don't get the service, right? And the reality of our current kind of like composition of the country, especially in urban settings, is that we have districts that have 40 to 50 to 60 first languages represented, right? So I do think that we ought to be intentional about how we are creating, as we are promoting bilingualism or multilingualism, we're not also creating inequitable spaces for other students who are learning English as an additional language. In a lot of the classrooms where I worked in Boston, we had 8, 10, 9 different languages represented. And that's where a framework like translanguaging, and we can get into it later if it's useful, that really understands, or as a pedagogical perspective, focuses on not only the spoken word or the written word, but all of these other semiotic resources that students bring to bear, where they can gesture, they can point, they can draw, they can use onomatopoeias as a way of expressing their understanding of the physical world in a way that it's not the same, as if you were able to communicate in Tagalog or in Farsi with your teacher, but it doesn't foreclose opportunities for them to join in. Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I think, Mark, you gonna take the next one?
Yeah, I can jump in. What a great discussion. I think that when I think about this question, I think about sometimes what the ends are that we're working towards in our classroom. And I think certain terms set students up for more success or less success. But I think it is important to identify the resources, the specific resources, maybe kind of what Henry is getting at, that students bring with them. Because I don't think we want to shy away from naming, right? Certain realities of students' lives, because a student that speaks Arabic as at home versus a student that speaks Spanish, they're bringing very different resources to the classroom. As a follow-up point to Henry too, it's funny with the research literature, with the 40% of students that speak Spanish as their home language, I would bet there's a high percentage within that group that actually doesn't speak Spanish as their home language, that speaks an indigenous language, right? Well, a lot of students from Central America coming into school. So I think that level of specificity is just really, really important. So with that said, I think that different groups of multilingual learners bring very specific experiences to the classroom that inform their learning. So one of the things we were able to do with our work is look at some of the subpopulations that maybe Dr. Drake is getting at within the multilingual learner population. We did a study looking at students that are classified to receive formal English language services, who would be, for example, at PK Young, where Dr. Jones were, ELLs, English language learners, and then students that passed out, right, that passed the access test that no longer receive English language learner services. Interestingly, both those students are multilingual learners. But the research literature cares an awful lot about the kid that is still receiving ELLs versus services versus the one that passes out and all of a sudden is just like everybody else. And sure enough, they experience instruction in unique ways. We found that in general, schools were doing a good job at choosing the right time to transition students, but oftentimes, for example, dual language students that transitioned did better in science achievement the year after they transitioned out of receiving ELL services. Perhaps different reasons for that, but the point being, students that are reclassified, their experiences are different from students that are still classified as English learners. So with that long-winded introduction, I was wondering if we could talk about specifically multilingual learners receiving ELL services, multilingual learners not receiving ELL services. How do their experiences with science learning differ, or what's similar perhaps? Tim, would you mind starting with that?
Yeah, I could jump in, though I feel like both Griff and Henry have like on the ground experience. Griff especially alluded to this in terms of if there are pullout services for these students, then they're not receiving the same dosage, so to speak, of science education. So that could be a way in which when these students are reclassified and no longer being pulled out, that they are then, in the classroom more and you can see their performance improve. Might be a hypothesis around that. Though I think when you controlled for their prior test scores, some of that difference went away. So accounting for these kids' prior performance, a lot of these things tend to go away. What I find interesting is, and I think I just want to stress one point that, and this is some research we did in Texas that found this as well. That on time sort of 3-year window, most states, that's around the time we like to get them reclassified and out. And of course, it's all concentrated, tends to be concentrated in these early grades settings in elementary school. They do a lot better than their peers that aren't reclassified. Long-term ELs, their life trajectories are very different. And even moving into higher ed settings, we find that they have the poorest outcomes of all the ways you cut this and kind of think about this subgroup. And so I think it's really important that you get classification right, and that you get it reclassified, or you get classification right, and then you get exiting that service at the right time as well to make sure it's important. But I'll defer to my colleagues in terms of this interaction with science and how it kind of plays out.
Go ahead, Henry.
I was actually going to pass it on to you because I have the least experience in terms of reclassification. So I'm actually really curious to see, to hear what from you, Griff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was going to kind of pitch it back to Mark and Chris, because I was trying to remember, and I look back on some of the papers today about how much time typically did you get a handle on how much time typically the students would be pulled out for their language instruction?
Yeah, it's a great question, and probably bumping into one of the limitations of the ECHLS data. I don't know that we're able to see, remind me if I'm wrong, Mark or others, I don't know that we see the exact minutes. And then probably most importantly, what we're not able to necessarily pinpoint was, are they being pulled out at a time that would have been science time, right? And I think that was kind of one of our working hypotheses, was just what you described, is we're missing science for pullout.
Yeah, so, unfortunately, I can't speak to the difference between the learners that had already been pulled out of the MML instruction because they had passed that bar. Because I don't, I wasn't privy to that sort of data on the students, you know. I would just see the ones that were already pulled out. But you know, that I think what still always gets to me is that the limited amount of time that and I know from your students, most of the grades that you were looking at were the early elementary, or was it the intermediate? Was it the upper level?
K-5.
Yeah, the data set spans K-5, kind of depending on some of
K-5.
our
It was just
analyses.
K-5,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, the kids are getting about, at least in K2, they were only getting, not at my school, I'm just saying in general, about 18 minutes a day of science instruction. And the, grades 4 and 5 are a little bit higher, more like, 23, 25 minutes per day. Even though in STA, the National Science Teacher Association doesn't really say exactly, what's the optimum, they say, but maybe around an hour, around 60 minutes would be nice, but they're basically saying they should be equivalent to the other subject areas, and when you look at reading, they're getting like 80 something minutes of instruction, and math is getting 50 to 60 minutes of instruction, and science is getting 18 or 18 to 25, on a good day. And so again, when those students are being pulled out, they're losing even more.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, just like a slight shift to thinking maybe more pedagogically about this. When I wonder if Henry, maybe you could jump in with thinking about, so you had mentioned translanguaging earlier, and oftentimes that's described as something that is useful for multilingual learners who are oftentimes understood as English language learners. But I think maybe some of your work or some of the work in general suggests, hey, this is an approach that's, you don't just have to be learning English as an additional language to perhaps benefit from this strategy. So I'm wondering if you could maybe talk about how a certain pedagogy might be beneficial for a multilingual learner who isn't necessarily an English language learner.
For sure, absolutely. Yeah. So I think that without going into kind of like a bit long spiel about translanguaging and what it is, well, right, okay. So there are multiple ways of defining it. I ascribe to the school of Ofelia Garcia, which basically says that people have just linguistic repertoires that they develop, and then those linguistic repertoires could be classified into buckets, things like English or Spanish or academic language or everyday language, but it's all part of the same repertoire. And because language is a useful tool for meaning making and collaboration, then people choose which resources to, leverage in that moment. But it's not like you have a Spanish speaker in your brain and an English speaker in your brain. With that conceptualization of language and languaging comes a real interrogation of the language ideologies that are in place in classrooms or learning settings or in any kind of like social environment where we have agreed upon certain rules or certain expectations about what it counts to communicate in that space, or what is a useful or an appropriate way of making meaning through language. So with that said, or with that in mind, I think that I agree with you, Mark, in that if we are able to examine the ways that we think about language and languaging in our learning spaces, it would be incredibly beneficial for everyone involved, not just the multilingual speakers, however we choose to define that, but also all of those other students who speak varieties of language that are often marginalized and being kept out from the classroom, right? Like not too long ago, well, maybe 30 years ago, some of you maybe weren't born back then, but in the 90s, there was a real concerted effort against, for example, Black English in schools, where the idea was that Black children spoke a broken form of English that was not conducive to their academic success. Therefore, they needed to be, communities needed to stop using, Black English vernacular because it was just part of, it was detrimental to their academic success. So if we're able to create learning spaces that are more comprehensive and are more flexible in terms of how we can communicate with each other and how we engage in meaning making about the natural world, I think that in and of itself is going to be beneficial, not only for multilingual learners, again, for students who speak English that are, marginalized and oppressed, even for disabled students, like this whole, the whole UDL, like one of the things that they push for is creating more opportunities for communicating information or receiving information. So, I mean, I think that in the science classroom, it can be a challenge, and it's good for my career, but not great for everyone else. So if you allow me to be selfish for a little bit, because the conversation then becomes like, how do we become more flexible about what counts as science talk, right? If you go to a lab, my experience in astrophysics, doing research all over the world, we used terminologies, but we were also not hemmed in by what counts as science talk as we would see in a journal. So in a way, as a field, science education has kind of like created almost like a caricature of what a scientist is and what a scientist sounds like, that again, it can be really detrimental for all students, because especially as a teacher, if I'm listening for air pressure, if I'm listening for Krebs cycle, then if I'm only listening for the keyword, I can let that student off the hook from explaining what exactly they mean by that. And it may be a missed opportunity for detecting a beginner's conceptual understanding and creating more kind of like pedagogical opportunities for them to continue to like make progress and understand things a little bit better. So I would imagine that, in addition to like, pulling all of those wraparound services that come with the classification, yeah, I think if we can just, just be a little bit more generous in that way, I think that it will go a long way.
I'd like to build on this thread, if I can, Mark, of kind of pedagogical practices. I think a big part of our NSF project here was to try to sort of figure out what seems to be effective in the classroom for multilingual learners and what was predictive or related to science learning gains on test scores or on teachers' perceptions of their performance. And we find some evidence that probably aligns with what you might expect in the literature of kind of more inquiry-based, hands-on sort of work seems to have some positive relationships. But we also see in kind of our analyses that are still ongoing, things that aren't consistent either, right? Or, variables that we might have expected to be related, not necessarily, showing these strong relationships to positive science gains. And I think, that may be a limitation of a large secondary data set and the kind of coarse way in which survey instruments are able to pick these things up. But I also think it probably relates a little bit to, Henry, what you're describing, which is the nuance behind that, right, of kind of what it actually means and how that instruction is happening in the classroom. And so we'd love to just hear, from the group, and maybe Dr. Jones, I'll kind of pass it to you as somebody that probably has the longest in the classroom, but what do we know about effective science instructional practices, maybe generally, and then more specifically for multilingual learners, kind of building on what Henry has shared here already.
Right. Well, the good thing is with the research that talks about what's good for multilingual learners is good for everybody. So as the classroom teacher, that was always nice. They were saying, well, and it became, this is a huge question you're asking, but to kind of distill it down, it's nice to go to, the National Resource Councils looked at the next generation science standards and kind of laid things out to say, that doing science, yes, it needs to be inquiry based, but it shouldn't be inquiry as prescriptive. It should be inquiry, but also taking into account, the student's prior experience, all the constructivism their prior knowledge. But also looking at, how science is done, looking at the practices. Now they call it, the latest terminology talking about three-dimensional learning, which is basically looking at yes, all the good science concepts, but weaving in, the connecting threads between all of the disciplines, as well as, how we do science. We used to call it the habits of mind, how that would generate that would govern how you would do the science practices and the engineering practices. So, whether it's creativity and or looking at being critical, but yet also open-minded, all of those sort of habits of mind that kind of oversee how the whole process is done. And then I think one of the most important things is when you're not only including students' prior knowledge, but you also try to frame everything that's some sort of phenomenon based, something that's connected to the real world, so that the kids can see, how this relates to them. So yes, it's inquiry based, but it's also phenomenon based. It's also looking at their prior knowledge, and it gets them, involved in actually doing the science. And the more that you can integrate other disciplines, the better. So not just, math and reading, but, looking at, art or literature, bringing in some of the trade books into the classroom. That's going to help with the multilanguage learners. If they need to, in their journals and reporting about writing down what they did in the classroom and did in the science lab, but also asking them to draw out what they saw, so get away completely there for at least one part of the lesson for them to describe what they, or to draw what they did, and to try to communicate even just through art what they experienced and what they saw and maybe what they think is going to happen in the future, do some predictions. So I don't know, that's kind of a convoluted answer, but there's so much we know more now about what is good science teaching. And I think that it's encouraging to see that it is happening, and that with organizations like National Science Teacher Association, and now with the Next Generation Science Standards to help guide the teachers, I think, following those guidelines can make a difference for all types of students in the classroom. Does that make sense?
I love it. I mean, you got to plug your work as well, right? So Dr. Jones has got some great videos that I think do a lot of this integrated with car crashes. So good examples. Mark, we want to maybe pass it to you for the last question. Then we're going to
final question, because I think it relates to what Dr. Jones is talking about. So part of our work, we looked at ecological systems theory, where we're looking at schools, not just as like classroom practice, but classroom practice as it relates to leadership, as it relates to communities and families, and all of these things kind of interacting on student learning. So what, I guess, what wraparound practices we might describe it, or like what wraparound services within schools do we think might be beneficial for multilingual learners in science classrooms? I recognize there's not a ton of empirical data on this, but I know you guys have all spent lots of time in schools working with teachers or teaching yourselves. So what do you see as being something that's like really important for science teachers at the school level or administrative level or community level? And I'll let whoever jumps in, whoever wants to jump in, that'd be great. Maybe just one final thought.
I feel like I've been doing too much of the talking when it comes to the classroom thing. So what you're saying, so what do you think is the most important to help support the
I'm saying, yeah, like right. Like sometimes we call it like a wraparound service, like something outside of the classroom, or yeah.
Well, I would think just continual ongoing professional development, because things change so much with instruction, and teachers are so busy and they need as much help as they can get in the classroom. And so I think if they could have sustained professional development, that helps them see that the best path forward in science instruction. And Henry would probably agree with this, because we're both sort of the physical science types. But when you look at when teachers say where they feel the most prepared when it comes to the sciences, they're like, oh, I feel pretty good about biology. I'm good with plants and animals and all of that. And even earth science is pretty good, you know, because they probably took a couple of classes in college and undergraduate about rocks and so on. And they're okay about that. But when it comes to the physical sciences, they're like, they feel the least prepared for physical sciences. And when you look at the NGSS standards, you know, a good half of them are physical science when you're looking at physics and chemistry. So, you know, so they need help on how to do this. They know how to be good teachers, but they also need some help with the content, and then also some nice tips on how to deliver that effectively to the students and to involve the students in that you know, science experience. Because predominantly, you know, they'll have full class discussions, and when it comes to doing active hands-on science investigations, you know, a lot fewer of the teachers feel confident enough to allow the students that free rein to do their own investigations. You know, and I read somewhere that it's like 60% of the elementary teachers have spent less than 6 hours in professional development in science over the past 3 years. So, you know, I think that just screams that, you know, they need some help. So whether it's, and I think there's a great opportunity to do it, to deliver it even online. There's a lot of great online webinars and things that can show them tips and tricks to do in the classroom. So I think that's probably the one thing that would help teachers teach science from a day-to-day is to have more professional development on a consistent basis.
I'll just add quickly, time. I think that we know that our multilingual learners, like, just they need the confidence, and they need to feel invited into the sense-making process. And sometimes when you have 25, 30 kids in, or 20, you know, 25 kids in one classroom, it can be really difficult for teachers to like have that moment to slow down and say, what's going on here? How are you thinking about this? So I think that, you know, if we can push in, is a little, sometimes a little complicated for me, because it brings all kinds of things into the classroom that sometimes is not helpful. But I think that having somebody else, like at least one more person to like dedicate space and time, is actually also like really, really important.
Really appreciate, you know, all those thoughts in the discussion. We're probably a few minutes beyond where we wanted to be, but I want to make sure we've got time to kind of engage with our guests here, and many of whom I know are bringing their own experiences right in the classroom or as researchers in the multilingual learner space or in the science education space. And so what we're going to do now is transition to the breakout room segment of the webinar. And in a moment, I'm going to open 2 breakout rooms. Breakout room number 1 is going to be what we're calling the policy-oriented room. So kind of a space to talk a little bit more about these issues from the policy level, from the kind of broader leadership, district, you know, kind of national conversation, macro level. And then breakout room number 2 is going to be what we're calling the practice-oriented room, which is going to be maybe a little more focused on discussions of classroom practice and pedagogy and instruction and kind of things that are happening at that more granular level. And so we're going to invite you all as participants here to choose either of those rooms, kind of whatever maybe feels of most interest or aligned with your research interests and work right now. Our panelists are going to split up across those rooms. I think, Tim, maybe we'll have you join in the policy-oriented room, and then Griff and Henry maybe in room 2 for the practice-oriented perspective on things. Mark and I will also be across the rooms, as well as graduate assistants and others that have been on the project. But we really want to just use this as a space to share out. It could be reflections on the panel. It could be sharing your own experience as a classroom teacher or research that you're doing in the space, but a chance to be in dialogue. So I'm going to go ahead and open those rooms. Again, room number 1 will be the policy-oriented room, and then room number 2 will be the practice-oriented room. We'll spend about 10 minutes there before coming back together as a group and debriefing and reflecting a little bit collectively and wrapping up. So we'll see you shortly in the breakout rooms.
Which is me. You said breakout room number 2 is the practical?
Yes. Yeah, Griff, if you want to go to number 2.
Got it.
Right. Welcome back, everybody, to the main session. Some really good conversations happening in the breakout room I was in. I trust the same in the other. We've got just a few minutes left, and so just want to give a quick opportunity for any kind of parting reflections or thoughts from any of our panelists, or if anybody else from the discussion wants to jump in with a quick thought, we'll welcome that as well. Tim, you mind if I put you on the spot? Any last words for the group?
Yeah, I'd love to. I just want to thank you all for the work that you've done these last few years. And like I sort of alluded to at the beginning, I think this is such an important intersection of science and multilingual learners. I loved how hard you worked at framing this appropriately, and I think really bringing attention through a quantitative lens, which I know is often not in this space. So it's really important to continue on both qualitative and quantitatively to push on these issues. So just appreciate the opportunity to work with you guys.
It's been a real pleasure having you part of the group and in the discussion today.
Yeah, I want to echo like what Tim was saying. I think that I really appreciated the interdisciplinary approach that you took to these questions. I think that, it's great to see how, and this is a multidimensional problem or multidimensional question. So I guess also like an invitation for everyone who's here is like, you've heard all of the different ways that this can impact schooling and teacher preparation and curriculum development and assessment development and instruction. So like, find that niche for yourself, like find that lever that you're really passionate about, and sort of like don't lose perspective from the complexity of the question, because I think that sometimes that happens when we become hyper specialized. But yeah, just sort of like go wherever you go next and just sort of like keep pushing and sort of like, try to activate those levers so that we can make it better.
Dr. Jones, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Did that automatically. I just wanted to pair one of the things that Henry said in our little breakout room is that, you have to realize that teaching is a ever learning experience, right? You always have to keep learning and look for those support groups that are out there that can help, because there's a lot of them out there, as well as your fellow teachers at your school that can help. But there's great organizations like NSTA that are out there that, can help with online professional development, or just support groups, chat groups, teacher tip groups. They're out there. You just need to look for them and reach for it. People are willing and to help and want to make every experience a good one for students.
Absolutely. Well, a big thank you for everybody being here today. We're right on the hour, and so we're going to wrap up. Thanks to Mark for being the co-PI on this project and helping facilitate today, and to all of our graduate assistants. Talked about them at the beginning, but we also have Lily Davis here, who wasn't on at the beginning and was actually key in helping bring this event together. So big thanks, Lily. And thank you all for being here. We've got a number of projects coming out of this broader project, actually just an acceptance to science education that came in through yesterday, some other hopefully forthcoming work as well. So if anybody's interested in reading more, we'll certainly pass along some links to those resources, and really appreciate the opportunity to share this space with you today, and hope to keep the conversation going.